The Wendigo is one of the oldest and most consistently documented pieces of North American folklore. Warnings about a starving, transformed entity that haunts the deep northern wilderness, passed down for countless generations across numerous indigenous communities throughout the northern United States and Canada. Long before European settlers ever arrived to hear and eventually popularize fragments of that old warning. Most modern retellings treat it as simple campfire legend. This is the account of a man who spent the final years of his long life convinced he had done something no one else in the historical record had ever managed, and who described, in remarkable, careful detail, exactly what happened during the several days he believed he held one genuinely, physically contained. If stories like this are the reason you're here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because I put out a new one every week. And this account is one of the most detailed and unsettling I have ever brought to this channel. Alright, let's begin. Part 1. Meeting Cornelius. I first learned of Cornelius Rodak through a small collection of unpublished personal papers donated to a regional historical society in the Northern Rockies, papers that included an extensive, handwritten personal memoir he apparently composed during the final decade of his life, largely for his own private satisfaction and for the benefit of his surviving family, rather than with any evident intention of broader publication. Cornelius was born in 1889 and spent the majority of his adult life working as a trapper and, later, as an independent mountain guide throughout a remote, difficult stretch of the northern Rocky Mountains, an area he came to know with the kind of intimate, decades-earned familiarity that few people in any era ever achieve with genuinely wild, isolated terrain. His memoir, spanning several hundred handwritten pages, covers the majority of his working life in considerable, engaging detail, but it's a specific stretch of pages, covering roughly 2 weeks during the harsh winter of 1926, that forms the basis of the story I'm about to share with you. I want to be upfront that Cornelius passed away in 1971, decades before I ever discovered his papers, meaning I never had the opportunity to interview him directly or ask any of the numerous follow-up questions his account naturally raises. What follows is drawn entirely from his own careful, extensive written account, supplemented by a small amount of additional context I was able to gather from surviving family members and from period newspaper archives that corroborate at least the general timeline and circumstances surrounding the events he described. Part 2. The Winter of 1926. Cornelius's memoir describes the winter of 1926 as one of the harshest he experienced across his entire decades-long career working that stretch of remote mountain wilderness, with sustained, extreme cold and unusually heavy snowfall that severely restricted his usual trapping activities and forced him to rely, more heavily than most winters, on a well-stocked, isolated cabin he maintained deep in the backcountry for exactly this kind of extended, difficult winter isolation. He described the trouble beginning, according to his own careful account, in early January of that year, when he began noticing unusual disturbances to his trap lines that immediately struck him, based on decades of accumulated professional experience, as inconsistent with any conventional wildlife he was familiar with throughout that region. He described traps found disturbed in a manner that suggested considerable strength and evident deliberate intent, along with an unsettling pattern of increasingly bold approaches toward his own cabin over the following weeks, evidenced by tracks he discovered, on several mornings, leading directly up to his cabin's exterior walls. Cornelius wrote that he initially attributed these disturbances to an unusually large and bold wolverine or bear that had failed to properly enter hibernation, explanations that, while unusual, remained within the bounds of his considerable conventional wildlife experience. It was a specific incident, occurring in late January, that fundamentally shifted his private assessment of the situation, an incident he described in his memoir with the same careful, detailed precision he applied throughout his extensive account. He wrote that he woke one night to the sound of something large moving around the exterior of his cabin, and that upon cautiously investigating through a small window, he caught brief, partial sight of a figure that he struggled, even years later in writing his memoir, to properly reconcile with any conventional wildlife explanation, describing something considerably taller than any bear he had ever encountered standing upright, moving with what he characterized as an unsettling combination of animal cunning and a deliberate, almost human quality of purposeful intent that immediately, powerfully unsettled him in a manner his decades of wilderness experience had never previously prepared him for. If this story is already unsettling you, and I hope it is, now's a good time to subscribe, because what Cornelius described over the following weeks grew into one of the most detailed and disturbing first-hand accounts of this particular legend that I have ever personally encountered. All right, let's continue. Part 3, The Old Warning. Cornelius wrote that following this initial direct sighting, he found himself recalling old warnings he had first encountered decades earlier, during his early years working in that region, shared with him by several older, experienced trappers and guides, along with considerably more detailed accounts he had gathered over the years through respectful, careful relationships he had developed with several indigenous families who maintained deep, generational knowledge of that mountain region, extending back countless generations before his own arrival. He described these old warnings as consistently describing an entity born from severe, prolonged starvation and isolation, particularly during harsh winter conditions, an entity that began as human but underwent a profound, terrible transformation once desperate. Extreme hunger overcame every other consideration, resulting in something that retained certain vestiges of human intelligence and cunning while becoming driven, from that point forward, by an insatiable, never-satisfied hunger that no amount of consumption could ever properly address or resolve. Cornelius wrote that the old warnings he had gathered over the years consistently emphasized the entity's cunning and patience, describing a pattern of behavior remarkably similar to what he had personally observed over the preceding weeks: gradual, escalating testing of a potential target's defenses and awareness, building toward an eventual direct confrontation once the entity had properly assessed the situation and determined the most opportune moment for a genuinely committed attack. He described making the deliberate decision, following his own direct sighting and his careful recollection of these old warnings, to take considerably more serious, deliberate precautions than his initial dismissive assessment had previously prompted, reinforcing his cabin's physical security as best his available materials and considerable practical skill allowed, and beginning to seriously consider, for the first time, whether he might be dealing with something that matched, in genuinely unsettling detail, warnings he had previously regarded primarily as colorful regional folklore rather than any literal, practical danger. Part 4. The Decision to Trap. Cornelius wrote that over the following 2 weeks, the pattern of disturbances and increasingly bold nighttime approaches toward his cabin continued and gradually intensified, reaching a point where he made a decision that he acknowledged, even in his own later, retrospective account, as representing a level of calculated risk that exceeded anything else across his entire, decades-long career in that wilderness. He described deciding, based on his extensive professional trapping experience and his careful, ongoing observation of the entity's apparent behavior patterns, to attempt an active capture, rather than simply continuing his defensive posture or, as most conventional wisdom and the bulk of the old warnings he had gathered would have strongly suggested, attempting to relocate entirely away from the area until the harsh winter conditions eventually passed. Cornelius wrote at considerable length about his reasoning behind this unusual, evidently dangerous decision, describing a combination of professional curiosity that had built over his entire career, a practical assessment that continued defensive posture alone might not adequately protect him given the entity's evident, escalating boldness, and, he admitted with some evident, lasting complexity of feeling even in his later memoir, a degree of simple, difficult to fully rationalize personal determination to directly confirm, for his own satisfaction, whether he was genuinely dealing with something matching the old legendary warnings, rather than continuing to operate on second-hand assumption and incomplete, frightening glimpses. He described constructing an unusually large and heavily reinforced trap over the following several days, drawing on decades of professional trapping expertise combined with his own careful, direct observation of the entity's apparent size, strength, and behavioral patterns, working with a level of careful, deliberate precision that he described as considerably exceeding anything he had previously applied to any conventional wildlife trapping project across his entire career. Part 5. The Capture. Cornelius wrote that his trap succeeded on the 8th night following its completion, describing waking deep in the night to sounds that immediately, unmistakably indicated his elaborate construction had functioned as intended, sounds of considerable, violent struggle combined with a series of vocalizations that he struggled, even in his own careful, extensive written account, to properly characterize. Beyond describing something that began with clearly recognizable animal qualities before, shifting, disturbingly, into tones and patterns that struck him as carrying an unmistakable, deliberate quality of genuine rage, and, more unsettling still, something he characterized only as a distinct, chilling undertone of coherent, purposeful communication. He described approaching his trap cautiously, at first light, equipped with his rifle and considerable trepidation, to find, contained within his elaborate construction, something that matched, in every significant physical detail, both his own previous partial sightings and the old warnings he had gathered over decades of careful, respectful conversation with knowledgeable local sources. Cornelius's description of the creature itself, preserved in remarkable, careful detail across several pages of his memoir, describes something tall and gaunt, its visible skin stretched with unnatural tightness over a frame that struck him as displaying signs of extreme, prolonged deprivation despite its evident considerable physical strength, with features that he found himself unable to properly, fully commit to paper even in the privacy of his own personal memoir decades after the actual encounter, beyond describing eyes that carried, in his own careful words, a hunger that had long since consumed whatever else that creature might once have been. If you're still with me, this is genuinely the part of the story where it gets considerably more intense. And I do want to say, one more time, subscribe now if you haven't, because what Cornelius described experiencing over the following several days, while he held the creature contained within his trap, is the most detailed and disturbing portion of his entire extensive account. All right, let's continue. Part 6. The Days in Captivity. Cornelius wrote that he made the decision, once he had confirmed the successful capture, to maintain the creature within his reinforced trap for a period of several days, driven by his own careful, considered desire to properly observe and document what he had captured, before making any final decision regarding how to ultimately proceed, a decision he described, in his later memoir, with evident, considerable retrospective ambivalence regarding whether it represented genuine wisdom or simple, dangerous curiosity that placed him at continued, unnecessary risk. He described the following days as involving careful, cautious observation of the contained creature from a safe distance, noting its behavior shifting, over the course of that period, between periods of what he characterized as exhausted, apparently genuine physical distress, and periods of considerably more alert, calculating awareness during which he described the creature's attention fixing directly on him with an intensity that he found deeply, persistently unsettling despite his considerable physical distance and the evident security of his reinforced construction. Most disturbing, according to Cornelius's careful account, were several occasions during that period of captivity when the creature apparently attempted direct verbal communication with him, producing vocalizations that, while clearly emerging from vocal apparatus considerably different from typical human speech capability, nonetheless conveyed, in Cornelius's own careful, considered assessment, distinct impressions of specific words and phrases, most disturbingly including, on at least 2 separate occasions that he documented with particular care in his memoir, what he was certain, despite every rational impulse to doubt his own perception, was his own name, spoken in a manner that struck him as bearing an unsettling, impossible familiarity he was entirely unable to properly explain or rationalize. Cornelius wrote extensively about his own internal struggle during this period, torn between his professional, scientific curiosity regarding what he had genuinely captured, and a growing, deeply unsettling conviction that continued proximity to the creature was having some manner of genuine psychological effect on him, describing periods of increasingly disturbed sleep, difficulty maintaining his usual careful, disciplined thinking, and, in his most unsettling and carefully qualified account, moments during which he found himself experiencing what he described only as considerations and impulses that he recognized, even in the moment, as being entirely inconsistent with his own genuine character and values. impulses he attributed, with growing conviction as the days progressed, to some form of genuine influence being deliberately exerted upon him by the contained creature. Part 7. The Growling Through the Cage. Cornelius described the most significant and disturbing single incident of his entire period of captivity occurring on what he believed was the 5th night following the creature's capture, an incident he documented with the most careful, extensive detail of any single passage across his entire lengthy memoir, evidently regarding it as the pivotal moment that ultimately determined his final course of action. He described approaching the trap that night, driven by a combination of his ongoing careful observation routine and a growing, difficult to fully rationalize compulsion he had increasingly struggled to resist over the preceding days, to find the creature apparently fully alert and immediately intensely focused on his approach in a manner considerably more direct and purposeful than any of its previous behavior during his period of captivity. Cornelius wrote that the creature, upon his close approach, produced an extended vocalization unlike anything it had previously demonstrated during his period of observation, a low, sustained growling that gradually, disturbingly resolved, over the course of what he estimated was nearly a full minute, into what he became absolutely convinced, despite every rational effort to doubt his own perception, represented genuine, deliberate, coherent speech, conveying, in fragments he was able to properly parse and later carefully record in his memoir, a message he characterized as alternating between what struck him as genuine, desperate pleading for release, and something he found considerably more disturbing to properly process, extended passages that struck him as carrying a distinct, unmistakable quality of threat and promise regarding what would ultimately happen, both to himself and to anyone else the creature might subsequently encounter, should it ultimately secure its freedom. He wrote that the specific content of this extended vocalization remained, even decades later in writing his memoir, difficult for him to properly, fully commit to paper, beyond describing his own overwhelming, immediate conviction, in the actual moment of hearing it, that he was dealing with something possessing genuine, malevolent intelligence and purpose considerably beyond anything a simple, starving animal, however unusual, could possibly be capable of producing or conveying. If this story is getting to you the way I hope it is, subscribe now, because I need to tell you what Cornelius ultimately decided to do, and about the fate of both himself and the creature he had captured, which remains one of the most genuinely difficult and haunting conclusions I have ever encountered researching a story for this channel. Alright, let's finish this. Part 8. The Decision. Cornelius wrote that following this pivotal, deeply unsettling encounter, he spent the remainder of that night in a state of considerable personal turmoil, weighing what he described as competing, difficult obligations, his own continued scientific and personal curiosity regarding the creature, his growing, genuine fear regarding the apparent psychological effect continued proximity was having upon him, and a broader, more difficult ethical consideration regarding what responsible course of action he genuinely owed to the wider world, given what he now believed, with considerable conviction, he had genuinely captured. He described ultimately reaching, by the following morning, a decision he characterized as the most difficult of his entire life, choosing to release the creature from his trap, rather than pursuing any of the alternative courses of action he had spent the preceding night carefully, painfully considering, a decision he attributed to his own growing, deeply held conviction that no responsible, sustainable course of action existed that would allow him to safely, permanently contain, or otherwise, properly resolve what he had captured, combined with his own genuine, considerable fear regarding the creature's apparent, ongoing psychological influence over his own thinking and judgment, an influence he grew increasingly convinced, the longer he considered it, represented a genuine and escalating danger to his own continued mental stability and personal safety. Cornelius described the actual moment of release with considerable, careful detail, describing his deliberate decision to open his trap's mechanism from a significant, careful distance using an extended length of rope, rather than risking any direct proximity to the creature during the moment of its release, and he described the creature's departure as swift and immediate, disappearing into the surrounding forest with a speed that struck him, even accounting for his own considerable, direct, observation of its physical capabilities over the preceding days as remarkable and, in its own way, deeply unsettling to directly witness. Part 9. The years that followed. Cornelius wrote that he never again encountered direct, unambiguous evidence of the creature's presence throughout the remainder of his decades-long career working that same general stretch of mountain wilderness, though he described experiencing, on a small handful of occasions across the following years, brief, ambiguous incidents that he privately, carefully attributed to the creature's continued presence somewhere within that broader region. Incidents he documented with considerably more restraint and uncertainty in his memoir than his detailed, extensive account of the original 1926 capture and captivity. He described his own relationship with that particular stretch of wilderness as permanently, fundamentally altered by the experience, developing, over the following years, a set of careful personal precautions and routines that he maintained for the remainder of his working career, precautions he acknowledged, even in his own later memoir, as likely appearing excessive or unnecessary to anyone lacking his own direct, unforgettable experience, but which he continued to carefully, consistently maintain regardless, driven by his own genuine, lasting conviction regarding the reality and continued danger of what he had directly encountered and, for several difficult days, genuinely, physically contained. Cornelius wrote, in one of the final passages of his extensive account, that he had spent considerable time, across the decades following the actual 1926 encounter, attempting to properly reconcile his experience with more conventional, rational explanations, genuinely, sincerely considering possibilities ranging from extreme isolation-induced psychological effects to simple, if unusual, misidentification of some conventional, if genuinely unusual, regional predator. He wrote that while he remained, even decades later, unable to fully, definitively rule out these more conventional explanations, he had ultimately, personally chosen to accept and carry, for the remainder of his life, his own direct, immediate conviction that he had genuinely encountered something matching, in remarkable, disturbing detail, the old warnings he had first learned decades earlier. Warnings that he had come to believe, based on his own harrowing direct experience, deserved considerably more serious, careful respect than most modern, conventional understanding was typically willing to extend them. Part 10. Closing Thoughts. I've shared Cornelius Rodek's account with you as completely and as faithfully as his own extensive, carefully preserved personal memoir allows, supplemented by the limited additional context I was able to gather regarding the general circumstances and timeline surrounding the events he described. I want to be honest with you that Cornelius's passing decades before I discovered his papers means I have no opportunity to ask the numerous follow-up questions his remarkable account naturally raises, and no way to independently verify the specific details of his experience beyond his own careful, extensive written testimony. What I can tell you, having spent considerable time with his complete memoir, and with what limited additional family and historical context I was able to gather, is that Cornelius struck me, across his entire extensive written account, as a careful, precise, and evidently honest chronicler of his own life and experience, someone who wrote with the same measured, detailed precision regarding this particular remarkable episode as he applied throughout the remainder of his otherwise entirely conventional, if genuinely impressive, decades-long career as a mountain trapper and guide. I want to close by sharing Cornelius's own final reflection on the experience, recorded near the conclusion of his lengthy memoir. He wrote that he had come to believe, across his own decades of considerable direct experience with genuinely remote, difficult wilderness, that the old warnings passed down across countless generations by the people who knew that wilderness most intimately deserved considerably more careful, respectful attention than most people in his own era, and likely in the era of whoever might eventually read his own account, were typically inclined to extend them. He wrote that he had personally learned, through an experience he would carry for the remainder of his life, that some ancient, persistent fears exist for genuine, well-founded reasons, and that the wisest response to encountering such fears was not dismissive skepticism, but careful, considered respect for whatever hard-won knowledge had originally produced them. That's the account of the last mountain man who trapped the Wendigo of the Rockies. shared as completely and as faithfully as Cornelius Roddick's own remarkable, carefully preserved memoir allows, and it remains, even now, one of the most detailed and genuinely unsettling first-hand accounts I have ever brought to this channel. If this one kept you up, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I put out a new story just like this one every single week, and I would genuinely hate for you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you believe Cornelius genuinely encountered and captured something matching the old Wendigo legend, or whether you believe, as some readers of his memoir have argued, that extreme isolation and the psychological weight of decades spent alone in genuinely difficult wilderness can produce an experience this vivid, this detailed, and this genuinely, lastingly convincing to the person who lived through it. Thank you for listening. And if you ever find yourself alone in genuinely remote winter wilderness, and you hear something moving nearby that seems, impossibly, to know your own name, I hope you remember Cornelius's careful, considered account, and I hope, above everything else, that you choose not to build the trap.